listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We just completed the Jazz Zone, and we looking at the MLK, Dr. Martin Luther King. We're still paying tribute to Dr. MLK, Martin Luther King, and joining us on the line from somewhere in the third world, as they used to say about Ernesto Che Guevara, is Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne is one of his most recent books is Armed Struggle, with a big question mark: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. And Dr. Horne, I think, is now living in Canada. And I guess we want to ask him about the trade wars. What are your thoughts on the trade wars that are going on right now, sir?
Well, I don't think it's going to work out very well for US imperialism. And indeed, we may be witnessing a development of profound historic import. That is to say, not only the decline and eclipsing of US imperialism, but going along with it, the eclipsing of white supremacy and the eclipsing of the North Atlantic bloc as a whole, as a direct result of the rise of the People's Republic of China. Just to recapitulate, you may recall that on April 2nd, 2025, Mr. Trump unveiled what he called Liberation Day. That is to say, he took on, sorry?
I said, yes, sir.
That is to say, he took on the world, slapping tariffs of various proportions on friend and foe alike, even on uninhabited islands. He was leaving no stone unturned in terms of this world war. What happened, of course, was that the stock market began to decline, and it seemed as if Mr. Trump was able to absorb that particular devolution, but then the bond market began to decline. What I mean by that is that historically, at least in recent decades, when there's been sort of ruffling in the international political economy of capitalism, there has been a flight to safety, with safety defined as investing in US Treasury bills. These are the IOUs that the United States sends to those who loan money to the US government to cover everything from the post office to the Pentagon. It has knock-on effects in terms of how mortgages are rated, in terms of the interest you have to pay upon car loans, for example. So it's of enormous significance. And what happened, instead of a flight to safety within the last 72 hours or so, you've had the yield on these treasury bills go up. That is to say, the United States has to pay more to get loans. And given the fact that the United States is already $36 trillion in debt, given the fact that it was about to roll over some of these loans, that is to say, to reissue them with a lower rate of interest, this had a shocking impact, not least on Mr. Trump, who you may recall in the last day or two announced that what was happening in the bond market caused him to suspend the tariff war against every nation except the People's Republic of China. And right now, there are 145% tariffs on goods coming from China across the Pacific to the United States. Now, Mr. Trump already has blinked. He suspended that tariff with regard to smartphones and laptops and electronic devices from China. The United States is heavily dependent upon China for those important cogs in the industrial machine of the United States of America. There is a kind of neo-colonial relationship, believe it or not, between China and the United States. Already, you see that the titans of industry in the United States are saying that the United States will be harmed if Chinese investment slows down into the United States, because just as 2 or 3 decades ago, China was beckoning US investment into China and therefore helping to hasten technology transfer from the United States to China, which obviously benefited China enormously. Now the shoe is on the other foot. The United States wants investment from China so that there can be Chinese technology transfer to the United States, particularly with regard to batteries, which are important in terms of the green economy, important in terms of these EVs, these electric vehicles. And in return, the United States sends China raw materials, petroleum, soybeans, foodstuffs, copper, and it's no secret that China can get substitutes for those exports. You can get petroleum from Angola, from Gabon, from Saudi Arabia, from Iran. You can get soybeans and agricultural goods from Brazil and other countries, etc. So it's amazing, this topsy-turvy world that we're now living in, where the United States has assumed the posture of a kind of neo-colonial appendage to the machine known as the People's Republic of China. And that's one of the reasons why in the elite journal, Foreign Affairs, published by the Council on Foreign Relations, a kind of think tank for US imperialism, a writer recently announced that China has escalatory dominance with regard to this trade war. What that means is that they can continue to escalate with regard to the trade war and not suffer that much damage, but the United States cannot. And of course, reference here what I just said about the United States suspending tariffs on electronic devices like smartphones. We also see that China is going to be limiting the number of Hollywood films that come into the Chinese market. Obviously, you can get films from Spain, from Nigeria, which actually produces more films than Hollywood. You can get films from India. I mean, they're easily substituted, for example. But this is going to be a blow to the political economy of Los Angeles in particular, whose economy is heavily dependent upon the film industry. I'm not just talking about these actors with their $20 million contracts, and obviously that's just a handful to be sure, but the camera persons, the set designers, the set decorators, the hairstylists, the makeup artists, the caterers, for example. Recall that when you had a strike in Hollywood within the last year or so, it unleashed blows from which the LA political economy has yet to recover from. And so we see that this is a major turning point that we're witnessing in world history. You can make an argument that for the last 1,000 years or so, there has been a titanic struggle between Europe and Asia, going back perhaps to the man we call Genghis Khan and his thundering horsemen who rode across the Eurasian continent, reaching the gates of Hungary. You can still see on the face of certain Hungarians the import and the impact of the Mongol incursions into Hungary. But now you see that when the Europeans began to recover, not least in 1492, with the plundering of the Americas, the onset of the African slave trade, that particular epic may be coming to a halt, may be coming to a close, which is obviously of significant importance. And I should also say that when you have these kinds of developments, it adds to the vernacular, it adds to our vocabulary. And I've noticed that in the Financial Times of London, a new verb has been introduced. What is that verb, you ask? De-Americanfy. It's a tongue twister, obviously. But what it suggests is that Europe should seek to distance itself from the United States of America, speaking of the European Union, which raises another question, which is, why did not Mr. Trump, if he was going to launch a tariff war, a trade war, which is now eventuated in a singular war against China, why didn't he try to enlist the rest of the world, particularly the EU, India, Japan, etc., against China, rather than going after the entire world and then having to back away from that? Obviously, it bespeaks the fact that Mr. Trump overestimated the strength of US imperialism when he went after the EU, India, China, Vietnam, and uninhabited islands. And now there has been a reset, but it's unclear if that reset will be sufficient. And once again, we may be living through one of the most significant developments on this small planet in the last 500 years or so.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Melinda, I guess you have some questions, of course.
Yeah, do we want to go to Iran and attacks on Iran?
Well, Saturday, April 12th, there were talks in Oman, or at least indirect talks, between the representatives of the Islamic Republic and representatives of the United States of America. You may recall that during the first Trump regime, he abandoned the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, the Iranian nuclear accord initiated by President Obama. It may have had something to do with the fact that this was seen as a victory for Mr. Obama, and that was something that Mr. Trump could not tolerate. The optimists amongst us have been hoping that all Mr. Trump wants to do is to return to the Obama Pact, the JCPOA, and simply remove Obama's name and slap Trump's name on the pact, just like Trump's name is sold to hotels all over the world, even though he has nothing to do with the hotels, but it's ego stroking and ego satisfying. But I'm not sure if that's accurate. I say that because in recent days and weeks, an enormous military flotilla from the United States of America has been sent to that part of the world, including sort of anti-missile defense sent to the US bases in that part of the world, because the Iranians have threatened to obliterate US military bases if they're attacked, particularly the bases in Iraq. There are also US forces in northeastern Syria, for example. And we also see that the island of Diego Garcia has now been festooned with US military men of various stripes. We also know that in the last week or so, the Prime Minister of Israel, one Benjamin Netanyahu, made his second trip to the White House within the last few weeks. Mr. Trump has only been in office about 80 days or so, and Mr. Netanyahu has been to the White House twice during that brief period. And even though in their Oval Office confab, Mr. Trump announced that these talks, indirect talks in Oman, would be proceeding, Mr. Netanyahu sat silently by. I'm not sure how to interpret that. Was this an example of him not wanting to go down the route of Mr. Zelensky, who contradicted Mr. Trump and got a tongue lashing in response, or what? But in any case, we know that the Zionist lobby in the United States wields significant influence, that the Zionist lobby has Iran in the crosshairs, that the Zionist lobby in Israel are facing enormous strains, not only because of an inability to crush Ansar Allah in Yemen, which has been raining down rockets in Israel on a regular and steady basis, despite being bombed on a regular basis by US imperialism. This may help to account for the fact that you had a rather stunning full-page advertisement in the Israeli press in the last day or two by reservists and military folk objecting to how the war in Gaza is proceeding and encouraging Mr. Netanyahu to focus more on what they refer to as the captives held by Hamas. Speaking of Hamas, they continue to not be subjugated. This crisis in Israel has led to an outflow of Israeli nationals to the four corners of the planet, particularly Australia, Germany, and Brooklyn. I should also say, in mentioning Germany, that this attempt by the Germans to continue keeping the Ukraine conflict afloat as Mr. Trump seeks to back out, or at least back out to the extent of seeking to effectuate normalized relations with Russia. And in return, of course, Mr. Trump is attempting to do a kind of buyout of the entire Ukrainian economy, including the so-called rare earth minerals that are allegedly embedded in Ukrainian soil. Well, Germany, under incoming Chancellor Merz, has also pledged to spend more on the military, once again, ostensibly for the benefit of the Kiev regime so they could better confront Russia. But we also know that Germany is probably second only to the United States, with Britain not that far behind, in terms of supporting the Israeli warmongers. And so, with that particular factor in mind, and given the fact that the Germans must know, obviously they do know, that in arming Israel, they're whipping up further conflict with Iran. This does not necessarily bode well with regard to the viability of the thesis I initially floated, that Mr. Trump wants to return to the JCPOA, except it should be called the Trump Treaty, and that will satisfy his ego. I'm not so sure, because we also know, referencing our previous point, that US imperialism is in crisis, is facing existential dangers with the rise of China. It may seek to right the ship by bombing Iran, and thereby demonstrating to the world, and demonstrating to China in particular, that US imperialism is not a spent force. In any case, this crisis in Iran needs to be focused on very carefully and intently, because I dare say that if Mr. Trump does pursue this atrocious path of attacking Iran, likely it will be opening the gates of hell.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Dr. Gerald Horne, author of a great book called Jazz and Justice. And can we talk about the Sudan and Southern Sudan and the turmoil there? And did we just escape World War III?
Well, with regard to escaping World War III, there are so many potential cases to point to. I'm not sure where to start. Perhaps that's a reference to this blockbuster story in the New York Times a few Sundays ago, where it was exposed what some of us already knew. That is to say, from bases in Germany, US imperialism was conspiring with the Ukrainians to shoot missiles into Russia. Imagine what would happen if the Russians were conspiring with the Cubans and the Black Liberation Army of the United States to shoot missiles into Miami. That would be a cause, in Washington's point of view, for launching World War III. But in any case, this crisis in Sudan is not necessarily going to induce or instigate World War III, but it's no less dangerous and bloody. Let me refer to a number of different aspects. One is that the military regime in Khartoum has just ousted from that capital the so-called rapid support forces with which they were locked in a bloody conflict. But at the same time, the regime in Khartoum has brought a case at the International Court of Justice with regard to the fact that the United Arab Emirates, which, by the way, is playing a very destructive role generally on the African continent, up to and including, according to the Khartoum regime, of supplying lavishly militarily the rapid support forces, which has unleashed a reign of terror in Sudan. It'll be interesting to watch how that particular case proceeds. But that brings us to South Sudan, which, as you know, seceded from the largest Sudan under the administration of former US President George W. Bush. Since that time, the nation has been racked with danger and conflict up to and including most recently the fact that the leader Salva Kiir, in a sense, has detained his number two, Mr. Machar, which does not bode well for future tranquility in Juba, in the capital. But on a more positive note, there has been some good news from that part of Africa. And what I'm speaking of is the fact that President Ruto of Kenya, who, as you know, is under fire for sending hundreds of Kenyan police officers to Haiti, and apparently they have not put a dent in terms of helping to bring that island back to stability. But in any case, he has been in close contact with the Chinese government, which has agreed to fund this railway that right now has stopped in Navasha, which was not necessarily a positive development, but now it's going to be extended to the border of Uganda, which is a very important development because it will help to increase trade relations between and amongst Uganda, South Sudan, Sudan, perhaps Rwanda, and Congo as well. Keep in mind, notably, that China, or at least Chinese interests, have been involved quite busily in funding railway development. For example, into Mombasa, the Indian Ocean port city of Kenya, and therefore you can easily imagine ships unloading in Mombasa and then being placed on trains and railway cars that then can go closer to the heart of Africa, up to and including Congo, South Sudan, Uganda. Recall as well that Chinese interests have been involved in building a railway from Ethiopia to Djibouti. Ethiopia is now landlocked because of losing its port on the sea, speaking of Eritrea, some decades ago. That has had tremendous impact positively on the Ethiopian economy. Keep in mind as well that the Chinese interests are beginning to refurbish the railway that leads from the Zambian copper fields to Dar es Salaam, the Tanzanian port on the Indian Ocean. In response, the United States has tried to enter the game by funding the so-called Libido Corridor, which leads from Zambia and southern Congo to western Angola, with the mineral wealth of Zambia and Congo easily transportable, according to Washington, to the United States of America. Indeed, even Mr. Trump has decided to not renege on the Libido Corridor, even though it was a major initiative of his predecessor, speaking of Joseph R. Biden. So in any case, despite the rather disturbing stories coming out of South Sudan and the larger Sudan, already you can see that there are more positive stories that are developing that hopefully will take precedence.
You're listening to Diasporic Music. Dr. Horne, could I ask you this question? John Garang, could you explain who John Garang was, and do you feel that John Garang, had he survived, wouldn't he be a positive force in terms of uniting the South and the South Sudan and the Sudan to be one country?
Well, we can hope so. I mean, the question calls for a bit of speculation on my part, but certainly John Garang, who, by the way, was educated in the United States, educated in Iowa, of all places, saw himself and was seen widely as a unifying figure who was seeking enhanced rights for the South Sudanese, more so than the secession that eventuated under the current leadership in Juba. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why his life came to a tragic end, which obviously has devastated or contributed to the devastation of Sudan. And since we're in that part of Africa, I should also mention another factor, a couple of factors that we may need to take into account in terms of plotting a way forward for the continent, particularly that part of the continent. And that is to say that the regime of Prime Minister Meloni in Italy has been quite critical of France, believe it or not, and its depredations in Africa, which, as you know, contributed to the kicking out of French forces from the Sahel states, including Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali. Prime Minister Meloni has spent time in Ethiopia in recent days, for example, and her line is that Europe needs to develop a strategy with regard to Africa that detours away from French neo-imperialism, she says, and therefore she says that Italy will be funding projects that either A, will allow for Ethiopians in particular to come to Italy to help fill the labor force, because Italy has a tremendous shortage of laborers, although I would encourage those Ethiopians before they cross the Mediterranean into Italy to keep up with the news, given the fact that dark-skinned people have been targets of violence by thugs in Italy. And at the same time, once again, she's trying to play catch-up ball, because in the story in the Financial Times that detailed what I'm now reporting to you, it was mentioned in the first paragraph that Chinese interests have built a major museum in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, that details the heroic victory of the Abyssinians, the Ethiopians, over Italian invaders in the 1890s, not to mention the violence inflicted in the 1930s by fascist Italy, in many ways the forebearers of Prime Minister Meloni, when it took a mighty thrust by the Ethiopians to kick out these latent unwanted visitors. So in any case, that is part of the news from Addis Ababa. And staying in Addis Ababa, let me reiterate a point that we've mentioned more than once. That is to say that in September 2025, there will be an important face-to-face summit, the first ever, between leaders of the African Union and leaders of Caricom, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, etc., with reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans being high on the agenda. There are those among us who are suggesting that Black Americans, who in a sense are part of the remit of the African Union, but obviously do not hold sovereignty, unlike Jamaicans, Trinidadians, Barbadians, etc., that nonetheless they hightail it to Addis Ababa to put on the agenda in September 2025, not only the question of reparations, but sanctions against the Trump regime because of the reign of terror inflicted upon Black people right here in the United States of America, which would be adding to the already emerging sanctions that are being slapped on the Trump regime, including, to come full circle, that new verb that we'll be hearing more about in coming weeks and months and years, De-Americanfy.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. I remember getting into many discussions with T in Providence, from who has a show on this particular, does a portion of this show. I would always tell him that at least, he's from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I would always say that at least you guys that have a vote, it might not, they might not pay any attention to it at that time because of the power situation. with people born in the United States, they can't even sit at the table. I guess you've had that same discussion in the United States with Caribbean people as well, right? Haven't you, Dr. Horne?
Well, this came clear to me in the fall of 1989. I guess I'm aging myself. When I went to pre-independence Namibia to do reporting on the upcoming election. Recall that was in the process of the decomposition of South African apartheid, which had been illegally ruling former German Southwest Africa, now Namibia. And it struck me that the United Nations personnel who were administering this nation and the transition from apartheid rule to independence, that a disproportionate number of the personnel were from the Caribbean. And that's because the United Nations, obviously, it has quotas with regard to who are able to go on these missions. And of course, the Caribbean nations bid heavily to be represented with regard to being personnel on the ground in Namibia. And during that time in Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, I was one of the few Black Americans who was present, who was probably the only one, because of course I was just there as a reporter. And that struck me the importance of having sovereignty, because then you're able to get dibs with regard to these sorts of assignments that the United Nations hands out and assigns.
Get some of the few people Chairman O'Malley Shatelli, Long Bay Brass they had contact with Sam Nyomo at one time, right? Oh, and Charles Burnett as well, right? Yeah. Charles Burnett, for those who don't know, Charles Burnett had a great film. Can't recall the title of it, but there's a film that Charles Burnett did on Namibia. It's a great film. They've shown it many places, and we've shown it in Canada as well. And Melinda, is there another question, or you want to say anything?
Well, we're kind of running out of time, but I guess reflections on, we're heading into this, 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. Maybe a little bit of comment on that, and we could wrap it up.
Indonesia, 1955. The leader, Sukarno, invites from the four corners of the planet, particularly from Africa, emerging Asia, and Latin America leaders. Interestingly enough, one of the few Europeans there were representatives from then socialist Yugoslavia. And it was quite an ideological and political breakthrough with regard to uniting what came to be the non-aligned movement, in many ways presenting the seeds for what has now materialized as the BRICS. That is to say, another bloc designed to undermine US imperialism in the first instance, and once again to come full circle with this so-called trade war blowing up in the face of Mr. Trump. We may be on the cusp. In fact, we are likely on the cusp of a transition of world historic importance, the eclipsing of US imperialism, which perforce means the eclipsing of white supremacy in the long run.
And thank you very much for that, Dr. Horne, and we will see you next week.
Up to you.
And Melinda, I'd like to thank Lisa Watson for keeping us on track, keeping everything sounding decent. And Melinda, would you have anything else to say?
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.